to what we can do individually. For the good of we the people, we must unite to combat the forces of tyranny. Jefferson told us to educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the only sure reliance of the preservation of our liberty. Your collective has done an admirable job in that mission. We have acquired a device which will serve both of our organizations well in the struggle against tyranny. But there has been a complication. The official we obtained the device from was able to set the device in an encoded container before he was captured. You are required to break this encryption. To do so, we believe you will require the information found in the following data. Please begin acquiring the information.
The economy of the 1920s is often described as a boom time, but not everybody was able to participate in it equally. For example, the switch to electric power meant that many coal miners and coal industry people suffered because of the lack of demand for coal. But more importantly is the farmers during the 1920s. Coming out of World War I, the farmers really suffered. During World War I, the fact that Europe was not able to grow its own crops meant that there was a high demand for American products. When World War I ends and Europeans are able to grow their own crops again, what ends up happening is that combined with the improving agricultural technology and now this loss of the European market, there is a surplus, right? So there's a drop in demand, there's also an increase in supply. So you have this surplus of crops, and with supply and demand being what it is, when you increase the supply and decrease the demand, the prices for the crops that they were able to get went severely down. So low prices for the crops meant that many farmers suffered during this era with foreclosures. In fact, by the time of the Great Depression, which hits in 1930, about 25% of farmers had already lost their farms. The 1920s economy is characterized by the industrialness of it. In the 1920s, we do see an increase in the factory production and mass production. In this case now, in 1913, Henry Ford had introduced the assembly line. So the assembly line becomes much more prevalent during this era, and more products are finding their way to the market. And those products like radios and refrigerators and other everyday appliances, vacuum cleaners, electric irons, these kinds of products. These products are going to be coming at a lower price than what one could usually expect. So more products at a lower price, more people are participating in the economy. That's all based on supply and demand. Remember, increasing the supply lowers the price. Unfortunately for the labor market, this marginalizes or lessens the ability of the workers to get what they want even further. They're still going to be underpaid, working in bad conditions, long hours, and there is an anti-union bias in the 1920s because this is, again, an era of republicanism, laissez-faire ideology. So this anti-union bias in the 1920s means that unions can't really protect the workers much. This also means because workers are, again, replaceable, low wages, cheap unskilled labor and all that, there is a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. Sometimes you'll hear this called income inequality, wealth inequality, but this gap between the haves and the have-nots is growing wider during the 1920s.
Nothing can stop the man with the right mental attitude from achieving his goal. Nothing on earth can help the man with the wrong mental attitude. That's what Jefferson tells us. You must continue your efforts, and you will be rewarded.
The economy of the 1920s is often called a consumer economy, and the mass media and advertising played a huge role in increasing the demand for these new products created through mass production throughout the new national marketplace. Everything's kind of tying together now. So there is a problem, though, in that there is an increased tension because media is telling people to go out and buy things, but the workers can't always afford it because, remember, the anti-union attitudes and this mass production requires cheap, unskilled labor. So when workers can't afford these items, they get really frustrated. There's tension between the haves and the have-nots. Luckily, retail outlets came up with a plan. It's called installment buying. There's a change in debt attitude in America in the 1920s. If you can't afford something, it used to be that you'd save up and purchase it when you had the money. But now in the 1920s, people want to be participating in this economy, and businesses come out with installment plans. In other words, buy now, pay later. You can see this in credit card debt today. This does stimulate the economy, which means as people purchase more and more items, the economy does get bigger and bigger and bigger, and companies can grow and have lots of profits. The problem is, and this is important, it contributes to the Great Depression of the 1930s, because throughout the 1920s, people are purchasing items on installment plans. However, eventually they come to a point where they run out of credit. When they run out of credit and have to buy things, have to pay off their debt, they're not able to buy anymore, and that sugar rush, which was this installment buying, goes away, and the companies crash, largely because they don't have the demand anymore that the installment plan had helped provide. The 1920s often is thought of in many circles as a time of liberation for women. Part of this comes from the promise of technology. All of the new appliances that were available because of mass production, vacuum cleaners, electric irons, washing machines, these were all promised to women to provide them freedom. That this would decrease the amount of time they had to spend on chores, and then they could go out and do other things. They could get a job, they could help with reform efforts and such. The problem with this is that when women bought the appliances, it didn't really have any discernible effect to reduce the time they spent on chores. First of all, working class women couldn't afford the appliances anyway, so they were still stuck doing it traditional ways. Middle class women bought appliances, but then fired the domestic help that they used to hire, so they actually spent more time doing chores than they had previously, and the wealthy women didn't have to worry about that anyways. So there really isn't a move towards breaking the traditional gender roles. Oftentimes the 1920s is characterized with the flapper. Flappers were these liberated, free women that broke the traditional mold of wife and mother. They could go be free, they could go out partying, they drank, they showed off their knees, they wore different clothes. They broke from those traditional gender roles. However, that is the exception that proves the rule. Very few women were flappers during the time period. Most women were still in the old traditional role, sometimes we call it the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood, of wife and mother. That is the role that women had. And it's reinforced by the media and advertisements of the time that paint women as being happy in their roles as wife and mother, and that's the only appropriate method that they should live their lives.
You have been working well. We do appreciate the effort you're making. Jefferson said that walking is the best possible exercise. Habituate yourself to walk very far. You may walk through the compound, but do not try to leave. That would have unfortunate consequences.
Thanks to Henry Ford and his assembly line in 1913, America entered a new era in the 1920s, the new era of the car and easier transportation. Transportation changes so much stuff in the 1920s, and it's going to, in the 1950s after World War II, take on an entirely different level. During the 1920s, we can see that if you could afford a car, it opened up a number of different things for you. First of all, you could live further away from work. So the idea of a working city is radically changed in the 1920s. If you can buy a car, or there's also streetcars available, subways, and all this, you can live further away from work, meaning that the people that move away from work are the ones that have the better jobs, that can afford to buy cars and to take public transportation rather than walk. So we start to see early suburbs start to form, where the wealthier people are moving away from the poor people living in the cities. This becomes a have versus have-nots issue. We can also see that in the countryside, in rural areas, the standard calls them country folk, the country folk can ease their isolation because you can get in a car and go visit your neighbors now rather than a full day's journey to go see your neighbors. It might be a 20-minute trip. It eases the isolation. It also provides a way around the railroads because you can put your crops on a truck now and take it to market yourself. These cars and trucks provide whole new patterns of living for the people that can afford them. There's also different dating patterns, which causes a lot of social tensions later on. more conservative people in the era thought that dating should be done in large groups or at the home. But now with a car, teenagers were able to have more alone time, sneaking off by themselves. One judge called cars houses of prostitution on wheels. So there's a social tension that comes with cars as well, in addition to the economic changes and the demographic changes. The 1920s was impacted by the 1910s and World War I in a number of different ways. One of the most relevant is that the Great Migration into northern cities had a large impact on the African American community. As African Americans moved into these cities, they typically were forced to settle into segregated neighborhoods, so sort of like the ethnic neighborhoods of immigrants. One of these is Harlem in New York City. They were pushed away from the South by Jim Crow legislation and lynchings, but they're pulled, the African Americans, into these cities by the cultural renaissance as well as the jobs. What happens in these black neighborhoods is that businesses develop by black ownership, leading to a resurgent black middle class. This black middle class supports writers, artists, poets, musicians in these neighborhoods, which leads to this just explosion of black cultural pride in this era. One great example is the development of jazz, but also poets like Langston Hughes and other artists and painters, sculptors, and such. They really focus on bringing a recognition to black culture and really showing off black pride, that it's okay to be African American in the United States. It does, however, point out second-class citizenship. In fact, one of the things that they were often talking about in this art was the recognition that they were second-class. Langston Hughes writes a great poem called I Too Am American, which talks about his second-class status. Recognition of the work of these African-American artists, especially jazz, Duke Ellington and such, and the role of mass media now bringing this black culture to the general population plays a huge role in eventually breaking down barriers between black and white culture. This 1920s Harlem Renaissance is really going to lay the foundation for the future 1950s and 60s civil rights movement. However, it's not all rainbows and buttercups. There is, because of mass media, African Americans are still portrayed in very stereotypical fashions. There is a movie that comes out called The Birth of a Nation, which portrays the KKK as heroic role models coming to save the day in the face of evil northern and black soldiers. There's a resurgence of the KKK that emerges during the 1920s because of this mass media. So there is also racial discrimination at the time, but eventually we do see mass media help out.
The official that we liberated this encrypted device from was a vile individual and responsible for many petty acts. It's unfortunate he was able to escape our pursuit. However, we were fortunate to have surprised him. Otherwise, we may not have obtained this device. We're working towards the same goal, you and I. Thomas Paine said that I love the man that can smile in trouble, that can gather strength from distress and grow brave by reflection. 'Tis the business of little minds to shrink, but he who has heart is firm, and whose conscience approves his conduct will pursue his principles unto death. Please stop trying to resist us.
Since Seneca Falls way back in 1846, women had been making a number of gains in terms of their rights. One that we focus on here is women's suffrage. Suffrage, by the way, means voting rights. Don't get confused. Throughout the Gilded Age and into the Progressive era, you should remember that women had won many suffrage rights state by state, starting out in the West and moving towards the East. And it's not until after World War I that women received full suffrage rights nationally with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Now, during World War I, women had taken many jobs that were left by men going out to war. They did many other things as well. They ran the home economy. They were secretaries in the War Department, nurses, and so forth. So women were expected, though, to go back into the home and take on the role of traditional housewife and mother after the war. Their reward for all their help was the passage of the 19th Amendment. They had promised that they would help clean up society if they had won the right to vote. This, unfortunately, not so much. They tended to vote like their husbands. Not many women actually ran for office, so they really didn't have much of an impact in this regards. However, we do see that after the World War I and with the passage of the 19th Amendment, there were also a number of new opportunities for women. The increase in mechanization and industry tended to help women because we're moving from a physical labor demand to more of a mental labor demand. Women take the roles of teachers, nurses, secretaries, telephone operators. It tended to be middle-class opportunities. Working class women could be, and minority women could be domestic servants, work in the factories, sometimes they're in sweatshop jobs. If they did have the same job as a man, they tended to make less money. So with the opportunity, there's still setbacks. And remember, the 1920s is often characterized by the flapper, these liberated independent women. But the flappers were the exception that sort of proved the rule. Women were still expected to fit into that traditional gender role. They were traditionally housewives and mothers, and the women that did go out and find other opportunities were either unmarried or they were young, waiting to be married. So Seneca Falls leads to eventually the 19th Amendment, and then we have all these other opportunities. The 1920s can be characterized by a number of social tensions, and one of them is a nativist fear of the other. World War I was fought as a total war, meaning that everybody needed to be on board, and this led to a large amount of propaganda against outsiders. This led to the 100% American movement, which fed into the traditional nativism that we saw during the Gilded Age, and xenophobia, which is this unreasonable fear of foreigners that was already there. After World War I, there was a large number of economic issues that also bled into this nativist and xenophobic issue. There was the transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy meant there was a large amount of inflation, which caused problems. There's an end to the wartime concessions to labor, which meant that labor had to fight again to get any sort of gains from the ownership. And the returning veterans were now fighting and competing for jobs. This meant that there was a large amount of unrest in the labor market. And this unrest in the labor market meant that there was a large amount of strikes. And the amount of strikes meant that the middle-class public was afraid that the United States was going to be falling apart. There was reason for this fear. Prior to the United States entering into World War I, the Russians had a revolution, a communist revolution, so this is not unheard of in an industrialized society. The Russian Revolution was fought by the Bolsheviks, which was a branch of communism. There was some fear that it would happen in the United States. In 1919, there was a series of anarchists' bombs that went up in a number of different areas. This led to the Palmer raids. A. Mitchell Palmer was, I believe, the Attorney General. Palmer wanted to run for office, probably president, so he tried to use this to make himself look good. 8 of these bombs went off around the country. There was rumors that there was more. So Palmer argued that we needed to round up all alleged communists and socialists and anarchists that we could find. And he did. He ended up, just for holding political views, Palmer arrested about 4,000 alleged communists and held them without bond, violating the First and, I believe, Fourth Amendment in doing so. Later, hundreds of them are going to be deported, largely with very little due process. In the end, what happens, Palmer kept arguing that there was going to be more attacks that were about to happen. These attacks never materialized. He's discredited, but the damage has been done, both because of the propaganda, because of the economic tensions, and because of the Palmer raids. These non-traditional views are going to be severely damaged, and this the nativism is really going to take hold throughout the 20s.
This must be difficult for you, and you may not understand everything you need to know right now. We are the Patriots' cause. We seek to liberate the people, and sacrifices must be made in this effort. Washington even said, "We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die, our one country's honor. All call upon us, from vigorous and manly exertion.
The KKK of the 1920s was a resurgent movement. The KKK of the Reconstruction era largely went away after Reconstruction ended. Now, the lynching and the racism of the era was still present, but the KKK organization had largely fallen out. It resurges in the 1920s, paired up with the nativism and xenophobic and anti-immigrant spirit that was brought on that we talked about previously. It provided a rationale for the KKK to reemerge. In 1915, a movie that won all the Oscars that year, by the way, called The Birth of a Nation, had already planted these seeds, and the KKK was painted in this movie as a positive force, that it was the heroes and protectors of the South after the Civil War. And it intensified the racism against African Americans. So African Americans are already on the KKK's watch list. When you partner this with the Red Scare of 1919 and the Palmer raids, now you can add radicals like anarchists, socialists, and communists. You can also add Catholics in there, which were seen as un-American and that they would be loyal to the Pope in Italy and not the American president. And really any other immigrant that would fall into this category. So you have the African Americans, radicals, Catholics, and immigrants that are also on these watch lists. The KKK saw itself as a moral regulator as well, that they were the good guys and that their way of life was best. So they don't like people that are going to break laws. So they also target bootleggers, gamblers, and any other people that they saw as un-American. Now, the rise of the KKK is helped out by mass media. We have all these new media tools, and they used advertising to promote membership. The movies like Birth of a Nation also helped to promote the culture that this was acceptable. So we now have an organization that during Reconstruction was mainly the Southerners against the North. Now it's a national organization. Small towns and cities through the Midwest and the North all have branches of the KKK at this time. And their tools that they use to promote their message are cross burnings, public beatings, and even lynchings. Now, the KKK falls apart towards the end of the 1920s because they saw themselves as moral regulators, but their leadership was participating in these massive drunken orgies. And the common KKK member said that this is the stuff that we don't really care for, and our membership dues are going to support those actions. So the KKK does end by the end of the 1920s, again, only to reemerge in the 1950s and 60s. In the 1920s, we can see that there is a period of xenophobia, this unreasonable fear of foreigners, and nativism, which is a very strict anti-immigration sentiment. And all of this anti-immigrant feeling led to a number of pieces of legislation being passed by our National Congress. Known as immigration quotas, these laws had been a goal of conservatives throughout the late 1800s during the Gilded Age. It's supported by this concept of social Darwinism, that some people are just bred superior to others, and that feeds right into this Anglo-Saxon or white supremacy that we can see in the KKK. The people that they were limiting tended to come from South and Eastern Europe, what we'd call the new immigrants. These immigrants are limited partially because of the social Darwinism and xenophobia. They tended to be poor. They tended to not have a whole lot of experience with democracy. They tended to clump together in ethnic neighborhoods. We can also see that Asians are banned entirely. This is a continuation of that policy with the Chinese Exclusion Act from the Gilded Age. Now, the quota system works very simply. A certain percentage of people are allowed into the country from a given area. Typically, this would be something like 2% of the population already in the United States would be allowed to come in. So if there's 1,000 Italians living in the United States, that means 2% of that would be able to come in, and that's 20 people would be able to come in from that country. So this severely limits the new immigrants, those old immigrants, which hadn't been coming in as such.
Our founding fathers told us that action will delineate and define you. We, the people, are people of action. You must prepare for the task that is to follow. When the time is right, you will be informed of the next phase of your mission. For now, continue your work.
In the 1920s, prohibition became law. This had been a long goal of progressives, starting with the temperance movement, which was trying to limit the amount of alcohol people drank. Prohibition was the legal restriction against it. This stems in part from an effort to force immigrants to act in that middle-class white society and force them to assimilate into that culture. It was a way to preserve the American culture, at least the dominant white society of American culture. During World War I, the propaganda against Germans, this 100% American propaganda, also helped because Germans tended to be the major beer and alcohol producers within the country. So by hurting the Germans, they were actually promoting that 100% American effort. So the 18th Amendment was passed in the 1920s, prohibiting the sale and distribution of alcohol, though not the consumption of it. And whether one complied with this amendment or not largely depended on class, religious, and ethnic identity. Lower and working class people tended to just disregard the law. There wasn't enough manpower to enforce it anyways. So the lower and working class simply they found areas, typically a speakeasy, or they made their own alcohol, and they just disregarded the law. The middle class progressives, they were temperate anyways. They didn't need prohibition to keep them from drinking, and the wealthy could drink all they wanted because they're wealthy, and according to social Darwinism, they had proved that they were better bred and they didn't need restrictions on them. So what ends up happening is when there is a demand, there will be people that fill that demand. And this is where speakeasies come in, these underground bars. And organized crime found a new revenue source. Now remember, people like Al Capone and the gangsters didn't arise because of Prohibition. They already existed. But what Prohibition did was provide them with another revenue source and made them even more powerful. There's not enough manpower. There's not enough police and detectives to fight all of the people that wanted to drink the alcohol, not enough to arrest all of the criminals that were violating the prohibition. So this proved ultimately to be a failure. And it's one of the reasons why eventually progressivism falls out of favor, because prohibition was one of their great success stories, and it ultimately proved to be a catastrophe. The 21st Amendment in the 1930s ends prohibition for a number of different reasons, the crime and lack of revenue among them. The 1920s also sees a conflict between traditional, conservative, rural, religious individuals and the more urban, more educated, less religious, scientific-based side of society. Now, in order to understand the conflict I'm going to talk about, you need to understand the term religious fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is when the religious organization believes in the literal translation of the religious text. There's Christian fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, Jewish fundamentalists. What this means is that you literally understand the text, in this case, of the Bible, which means when Jonah is swallowed by the whale and is in the whale's belly for 3 days, it literally means he was swallowed by the big fish in the belly for 3 days, spit back up on the land. It's not an allegory, it's not a myth, it actually literally happened. The issue with this is that when Charles Darwin and others proposed their theory of evolution, it challenges that literal translation of the Bible. And there are other issues with science and religion, but it's this tension between science and religion that we see emerge in the 1920s, most famously characterized in the Scopes trial, also called the Scopes monkey trial because it deals with evolution. Tennessee had a law in the books that forbid teaching of Darwin and natural selection and evolution within public schools. From their perspective, they're protecting their children from the ravages of eternal fire in hell. Scopes goes into the classroom, deliberately breaks the law because he wants to create what's called a test case. He doesn't think that this law is legitimate. He wants to break the law. It's almost like civil disobedience. He's defended by an American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU attorney, Clarence Darrow. On the Tennessee side, the loser of the 1896 election, William Jennings Bryan, a religious fundamentalist himself, defends the law. In the end, nobody really wins. Both sides claim that they win. Both sides claim the other side looks foolish and bad. But what it does is show us the tension that was existing within society that still exists today. We know that even today, the rural side, more conservative, tends to be more religious. Liberal, urban, more educated people tend to be a little less religious, more scientific. So in the end, the teachers find receive the fine, and that law stays on the book in Tennessee until well into the 1960s.
Your contribution to your collective demonstrated your abilities to us, and we were in need of your services. We have been unable to decrypt this box, and we believe the time is running out. We have ways of motivating the reluctant. Franklin reminds us that early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. You've had a long day. Sleep now. We'll speak more in the morning.